My grandfather flew 6 hours to attend my brother's wedding. They sat him behind the trash bins. When I spoke up, my mother slapped me, then had me thrown out like a stranger. What they didn't know was, he owned the vineyard. And what came next? It wasn't just a reckoning, it was a homecoming. This is a story about betrayal, buried wills, poisoned wine, and the truth they tried to erase. It's about how I went from being the forgotten daughter, to the one who held everything together. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, like your voice didn't matter, this story is for you. Welcome to ErasedMe, where silence ends and the truth begins. Subscribe if you're ready to remember what loyalty, courage, and legacy really mean. The Napa sun was supposed to be golden, romantic, the kind you see on wedding invitations and in lifestyle magazines. But that afternoon, it felt harsh. It cut shadows across the stone walkway and made the designer sunglasses on the guests' faces gleam like shields. I stepped out of the rideshare car wearing a forest green dress I'd bought secondhand the week before. It had capped sleeves and a soft cotton feel that reminded me of Sunday mornings in Boston, quiet, lonely, and always a little too cold. My heels clicked softly as I moved toward the patio where music and laughter drifted like perfume. Everyone was already posing for photos, sipping champagne from slender flutes, clustered in pairs and trios like curated bouquets. No one turned when I arrived. Not even Jason. I caught my reflection in the glass of a nearby door, bare face, wind-tossed curls, freckles unapologetically visible. I looked like someone who had RSVP'd by accident. Decent, my mother's voice cut through the air like a verdict. I turned to see her standing behind me, her expression unreadable except for the slight purse of her lips and the flick of her eyes down my body. At least the neckline isn't scandalous. That was her greeting. No hug. No, you made it all the way from Boston. Not even a mention of the fact that I'd flown in alone. She turned away before I could respond, gliding toward a woman in a gold dress whose laughter could split glass. Jason stood beneath the olive trees with his college friends, laughing in that too loud, half-drunk way that made it clear he was already 2 bourbons in. His fiancée, Lily, was radiant in an ivory lace gown that looked hand-stitched by angels, and cost more than my grad school tuition. Her gaze passed over me like static. We'd met twice. Apparently, it didn't stick. I didn't come to be noticed. I came because, for all their frost and performance, they were still my family. I told myself that lie until my grandfather's car pulled up. A black town car rolled slowly down the gravel path. The door creaked open, and out stepped Grandpa Joseph. His suit was wrinkled at the edges, his tie crooked, and his knuckles spotted like brown parchment. But when he saw me, he smiled. Eyes soft, misty. "Kais," he rasped, voice thin but steady. "You're the only one worth flying for." I hugged him tighter than I meant to. He smelled like peppermint gum and aftershave, the same as when I was 6 and he used to sneak me into his study to eat chocolates my mom said would rot my teeth. He'd flown 6 hours across the country at 82. For this. For them. A staffer in a black vest waved us forward. "You're over here," he said, gesturing toward the edge of the patio. We followed. Past the flower arch, past the pond. Past the gourmet catering kitchen and a chorus of champagne toasts. The scent of grilled duck thickened as we turned a corner, and then stopped. One plastic folding chair. Placed between 2 overflowing trash bins. Next to a vent that pumped out warm, greasy air from the kitchen. My stomach dropped. "This can't be right," I said, looking around. The staffer checked a clipboard, shrugged, and disappeared like smoke. Grandpa sat down slowly. His knees cracked. He didn't complain. I turned and saw her. My mother, standing less than 20 feet away, admiring her bracelet in the sunlight like it was the only thing worth acknowledging. "Why is Grandpa sitting back here?" I asked, my voice sharp but calm. She didn't look at me. "He insisted on coming," she said flatly. I told him he wouldn't enjoy himself. Beggars can't be choosers. He's not a beggar, I snapped. My hands were fists at my sides. She turned. Her whisper came fast and poisonous. That old man will embarrass us. The way he talks. The way he eats. The way he smells. She said it with venom and ease, like it wasn't new to her. Like she'd said it before, behind closed doors, over cocktails, to guests who laughed politely and agreed. You're serious? I said. Her face didn't change. Cold. Polished. Unshaken. I walked away. Not because I gave up, but because I couldn't breathe standing near her. I sat down at a far corner table, near the valet's son, apparently, staring into a glass of untouched sparkling water, fingers trembling on the rim. That's when it happened. The music lowered. The murmur of conversations dulled. And something inside me cracked, not a scream, not even a sob. Just a tremble of truth. I stood. Took the fork from the table. Walked to the welcome arch and tapped my glass once, then again. Excuse me, I said, voice unsteady but audible. I just have one question. Why is my grandfather, the man who flew 6 hours to be here, seated next to the trash bins, while strangers sit at the family table? The silence that followed was the kind you don't recover from. Then, the sound of heels. My mother's. She reached me in 3 strides. And before I could blink, her palm struck my cheek. It cracked like a gunshot. You ungrateful thing, she hissed, cheeks flushed with rage. You don't belong here. She turned to a staffer. Escort her out. I didn't cry. Not when her slap burned across my cheek. Not when the guests stared and whispered behind champagne flutes. Not even when Jason turned away like I was some distant inconvenience. I walked out of that wedding like I'd rehearsed it 100 times, back straight, heels catching in gravel, dignity dragging behind me like the hem of my dress. At the edge of the patio, I paused. Just past the rose arbor stood a low stone wall shaded by olive trees. I sat there, my pulse still racing from the humiliation, from the disbelief that no one, not one single person, had spoken up. Except Grandpa. He'd tried to rise when my mother hit me. I saw it. His knuckles tightened on the arms of that plastic chair. But no one helped him. No one offered a hand. And he was too old, too tired. I wiped my cheek and tried to breathe. Then I felt it, something in my palm. Grandpa had pressed it into my hand before I left. A silk handkerchief, emerald green, frayed at the corners, stitched with a silver letter, K. My first initial. I hadn't noticed him slip it to me. But somehow, it had more weight than anything anyone had given me in years. I curled my fingers around it, holding it like an anchor. That's when I heard the sound. Not footsteps. Not voices. Something deeper. A low rumble that rolled across the gravel like distant thunder. I stood, squinting down the drive. Then I saw it. A black Rolls-Royce, gleaming in the late afternoon sun, glided into view like a ghost in velvet. Behind it, 2 sleek SUVs followed in formation. The air shifted. Even the trees seemed to quiet. The front door opened. A driver in a pressed gray uniform stepped out and moved briskly to the back door. With slow precision, he opened it. And out stepped Grandpa. But not the hunched man from earlier, not the forgotten elder tucked by the trash. This man was different. He stood tall, shoulders back, cane in one hand, the other adjusting sunglasses that were definitely not from a drugstore. His navy suit had been changed, perfectly tailored now, the kind of fabric that catches sunlight like water. His shoes shone. And he didn't look confused or out of place. He looked like he owned the world beneath him. 2 men in black suits flanked him, alert, scanning, silent. Not just drivers. Not just assistants. These were the kind of men who moved when power did. I stepped forward, stunned. "Grandpa?" I asked. He turned toward me, pulled off his glasses, and smiled. "Well, sweetheart," he said, voice clear and full. "Ready to shake things up?" I nodded before I even knew why. He offered me his arm. I took it. As we approached the gate, the same one I'd been thrown out of, one of the staff stepped aside and opened it without a word. He didn't even check a list. "Wait," I whispered. Why are they?" Grandpa didn't stop walking. "They remember now," he said. "Or maybe they finally see clearly." And just like that, it clicked. This vineyard. These hills. This land. It was his. He wasn't just a guest. He was the foundation beneath all of this. The reason Jason had a venue. The reason champagne flowed and roses bloomed. They'd built this celebration on his legacy, then shoved him into the shadows. We didn't head straight to the crowd. Not yet. Grandpa led me around the back, down a shaded stone path lined with citrus trees. The breeze shifted. I could hear my mother's voice rising on the speakers in the distance, boasting about family, tradition, ambition. And I smiled. Because the real tradition, the one with roots, with memory, was now standing beside me. And we were just getting started. We approached the patio from the side path, the hum of clinking glasses and polished laughter growing louder with each step. Music played softly, a string quartet tucked under a pergola strumming something classical and forgettable. The late sun stretched long golden shadows across white tablecloths, catching glints off crystalware and diamond bracelets. My mother's voice, amplified and proud, rang out from the center of it all. Jason's vision, his ambition, it's what built this celebration. He's always been the kind of son who. We stopped just behind a row of potted olive trees. Grandpa didn't move right away. He tilted his chin slightly, listening. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture, subtle but firm, hardened. I stayed behind him, fingers tied around the silk handkerchief in my pocket. The crowd clapped politely as my mother raised her glass. Jason stood next to her, flushed with drink and self-importance, arm around Lily, who looked like she'd memorized how to smile for photographs without actually feeling anything. And then the room, if you could call it that, changed. Grandpa stepped forward. Not rushing. Not stomping. Just claiming space that was always his. The quartet faltered. The chatter died. At first, no one even seemed to realize what was happening. Then faces turned. One by one. Like a breeze that slowly tipped every head toward the storm on the horizon. My father was the first to recognize him. His mouth parted slightly, wine glass frozen mid-air. Jason's hand dropped from Lily's waist. My mother blinked once, twice, as if trying to place a memory she hadn't summoned in years. Grandpa didn't speak. He simply reached up and gently, deliberately, took the microphone from my mother's hand. She didn't resist. She just stepped back. That silence? It wasn't the polite kind. It was thick. Awkward. Disbelieving. I wasn't going to say anything, Grandpa began, his voice calm but impossibly heavy. Didn't want to ruin a wedding. Didn't want to make a fuss. A few people gave small, uncertain chuckles. But then again, he continued, eyes scanning the crowd, maybe it's time people knew what really built this family. I could see my father's fingers twitch toward his blazer pocket, probably reaching for the speech he'd prepared. Jason stared down at his shoes. The bride's parents exchanged glances. The string quartet set down their bows. I'm 82, Grandpa said. I built this vineyard with these hands. Named it after my late wife. Gave it to the family with the hope that they'd treat it with the same love we poured into the soil. He turned slowly toward my parents. But when I flew here today, no one greeted me. No one knew I was coming. Because my name wasn't on the guest list. The driver didn't even recognize me at the gate. There were audible gasps now. I sat near the trash bins, he said, smiling faintly. Right next to the kitchen vent. Now, I'm not much for fancy seating charts, but I know the difference between a seat and a message. He took a long pause. And I received that message. Loud and clear. My mother was pale. My father swallowed hard, his throat bobbing like a man who'd forgotten how to breathe. Jason hadn't moved. Lily had turned fully toward Grandpa now, her mouth slightly open. But he wasn't done. He looked toward the edge of the patio, toward me. I hadn't planned to step into the light. But now I did. Quietly. Deliberately. I walked forward and stood near the stone column beside the reception arch. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I left this land in her name, Grandpa said, his voice lower now. Because she was the only one who visited me when I was sick. You remember, don't you, Richard? My father's eyes widened. You changed the documents, didn't you? Grandpa continued. While I was still recovering. You forged my signature. You told the lawyer I was unfit. A murmur swept the crowd. Jason finally lifted his head. Whatever this is, he said, voice tight, it's not the place. Let's talk about this later. No, I said. My voice didn't tremble. No, Jason. This is exactly the place. You told me I didn't belong here. You watched them seat Grandpa next to trash bins and said nothing. And now you want silence? The tension snapped like a taut wire. Grandpa reached into his blazer and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. Thick. Sealed. Notarized. He handed it to me. This is yours, he said. It always was. Jason stepped forward, face red. He changed the will after he got sick. That's not valid. It's not. Is that true? Someone asked. One of the uncles. I never remembered his name. He stood from the third table on the left, squinting at the envelope in my hand. I looked down. The date printed clearly across the top, 2 months before Grandpa got sick. There was a sharp intake of breath. I hired a private investigator, Grandpa said. And he found more than I ever wanted to see. He walked to a small table near the string quartet, laid down photographs, copies of legal forms, surveillance stills of my father entering an office late at night. One document in particular, the medical affidavit claiming Grandpa was mentally unfit, was signed by a physician who hadn't examined him in over 10 years. And the signature? Wobbly. Loose. Unfamiliar. The silence was volcanic. You stole it, Grandpa said. Not from me. From her. He pointed to me. Jason looked stunned. His voice broke when he said, I didn't know they cut her out completely. I didn't mean to. You locked her out of the vineyard, Grandpa snapped. Changed the security codes. Barred her from the harvest. Erased her name. The guests looked from face to face. Some whispering. Some turning red. A bridesmaid kicked off her heels and muttered something about this being a circus. Then Grandpa raised his cane and slammed it onto the table. You don't get to rewrite history. Not with lies. Not with signatures forged in the dark. He turned to the officiant, who stood frozen at the head of the aisle. Cancel the wedding. The officiant blinked. Sir? There will be no vows today, Grandpa said, his voice ringing out like thunder. This family needs a reckoning first. And then, silence again. But this time, it didn't feel awkward. It felt inevitable. The vineyard slept beneath a velvet sky when the call came. I was sitting on the edge of the bed in the guest room Grandpa had insisted I stay in that night, his old study, converted but still lined with books that smelled like dust and memory. The envelope with the deed lay untouched on the nightstand beside me. I'd run my fingers along its seal more times than I could count. The phone buzzed once. Then again. Matteo. I hadn't heard from him in years. Not since he disappeared after Jason restructured the team a few seasons ago, quietly, without warning, like they wanted him forgotten. I answered. Hello? His voice was low. Urgent. You need to come. Now. Matteo, what? They're trying to destroy it. The last batch. I think they already started. I didn't ask what he meant. I just grabbed my coat, the envelope, and the small voice recorder Grandpa had slipped into my bag earlier. In case they try to bury more than your name, he'd whispered. Don't let them erase her too. By the time I reached the back entrance of the vineyard's processing facility, the stars had begun to fade behind a thin line of gray morning. Matteo met me by the fermentation building, wearing a hoodie and a cap pulled low. They didn't see me, he said, breath clouding in the chill air. I was checking something for a supplier when I saw Jason come in. He wasn't alone. He swiped his keycard through the side panel, and the lock clicked. Inside, the air hit me hard, sharp, chemical, not the soft tang of wine in progress. Something more artificial. Harsher. What is that smell? I asked, pulling my collar over my nose. Solvent, he whispered. Industrial grade. Not cleaning supplies. Something you use to ruin an entire batch. We turned the corner and stepped into the fermentation room. 3 stainless steel tanks loomed like silent beasts in the dark. One of them hissed faintly, a thin foam clinging to its edges. My eyes stung. The Syra blend? I choked out. Matteo nodded once. The last one Carmen worked on before she passed. You remember, it was supposed to be bottled next month. I stumbled back against the wall. I could still see her in that room, hair pulled back, stained notebook in one hand, murmuring to herself about tannins and soul and how good wine needs grief in the right dose. And now they were poisoning it. They wanted to erase her, I said aloud. Not just legally. But physically. Spiritually. Matteo reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small USB stick. I copied the security feed before they could wipe it. Jason came in twice this week. Late. Looked over his shoulder both times. Why are you showing me this? I asked. He hesitated. Because he offered me 10 grand to shut up. I took it. Then I called you instead. I stared at him. I figured, if anyone would fight for this place, it's the girl who used to scrub barrels with her grandmother like it was holy work. My chest ached. I took the USB, slid it into my coat, then turned back to the tanks. My reflection stared back, warped, uncertain. She spent her final summer on this blend. Every night after dinner, she'd come in here and hum while she worked, calling the wine her last song. I pulled out my phone and began photographing everything, foam patterns, chemical stains, even the clipboard left behind with Jason's initials scribbled at the top. Matteo handed me a bottle. I salvaged this. Untouched. You'll need it for testing. I took it. My hands trembled. I didn't go home. I drove straight out past the county line, pulled over beneath an old walnut tree, and watched the dawn pull itself across the sky like a healing wound. If I exposed this, I'd destroy what little was left of our family's public image. If I stayed quiet, I'd let them kill her again. I closed my eyes and saw Carmen's hands, purple-stained, guiding mine. She used to say, wine remembers who makes it. And I intended to make sure this wine remembered her. The boardroom at the Vineyards estate building was a cathedral of wood and glass, oak-paneled walls, heavy leather chairs, and windows that opened to views of sun-drenched vines. But that morning, it felt colder than any courtroom. The sleek black sedans had started arriving just after sunrise. Shareholders, legal advisors, A few board members I'd never even met, people who cared more about margins and brand image than roots and truth. I walked in without knocking. Jason was mid-sentence, hands moving like a man trying to spin disaster into a story about innovation. His voice faltered when he saw me. Then he saw the bottle. And the flash drive. I placed both on the polished table like a pair of loaded weapons. Before he could speak, I walked to the projector in the corner, slid the USB into the port, and turned toward the screen. Please watch. The footage played in silence. Jason entering the fermentation wing after hours. The timestamp clear. His eyes darting. A shadowed figure beside him, one of the junior managers. Then the unmistakable image, Jason pouring something into the tank. Frame by frame. Clinical. Inescapable. My mother, seated at the end of the table in a high-neck beige dress, leaned back slowly, face frozen. This is a fabrication, Jason said, standing abruptly. It's a personal vendetta. Sit down, one of the shareholders said sharply. A quiet man from Napa I barely knew. His voice was calm but final. If this footage is authentic, it constitutes intentional product sabotage. That's felony-level misconduct. The legal officer beside him nodded grimly. And if your name is on the override protocols authorizing chemical access, the man continued, now turning to my mother, this isn't just Jason's problem. I didn't have to say a word. I simply tapped my phone. A photo appeared on the screen, the laminated emergency protocol pinned to the processing hallway. My mother's signature in red ink across the bottom. Dated last week. This wine, I said quietly, was the last blend my grandmother helped craft before she died. You didn't just sabotage a product. You desecrated her memory. My father finally spoke. His voice cracked. You'll destroy us all, Kais. Think about what you're doing. I have, I said. All night. The door creaked open. Grandpa stepped in. He wore the same navy suit as the night before, but now with a black wool scarf wrapped at his neck and his old wooden cane tapping softly across the tile. The lawyer who followed him carried a thick envelope. I apologize for the delay, Grandpa said, his voice gravelly but firm. There was one more thing I needed to sign this morning. The lawyer opened the envelope, cleared his throat, and addressed the room. Effective immediately, Miss Kais Ventnor holds full power of attorney over all family operations. This includes land rights, distribution licenses, and corporate decision-making authority. The vineyard and its assets are now secured under a separate estate trust in her name. My breath caught. I hadn't expected it to happen like this. Not here. Not in front of all of them. Grandpa turned to my mother. His tone softened, but his words didn't. You disowned her out of pride, he said. You called her a burden. An embarrassment. But now it's her name that saves you from collapse. Jason slammed his chair back and stormed out. No one followed. My mother blinked rapidly, her lips parting and closing like a woman trying to speak underwater. My father just looked down at his hands. We were protecting the brand, she murmured. No, I said. You were protecting your egos. You would have let everything rot if it meant you stayed in control. The room fell into a hush that felt clean. Like something old and poisonous had finally been exhaled. I gathered the deed, the bottle, and my grandmother's sketch of the vineyard, the one Mateo had found tucked behind her desk in a linen handkerchief. Then I walked toward the door. But before I reached it, I turned. Do not mistake my silence as surrender, I said. It was survival. And then I left, with the truth finally, on my side. 3 weeks later, the vineyard no longer felt like a battlefield. It breathed again. The sun dipped low over the hills, casting amber light on the new pergola Mateo and I had built near the rose trellis. Paper lanterns swayed gently from olive branches, glowing like soft stars. Tables lined the lower garden, covered in white linen and scattered with bowls of fresh bread, rosemary focaccia, and small plates of cheeses wrapped in butcher paper. There were no speeches. No photographers. No champagne fountains or velvet ropes. Just the people who'd stayed, who'd worked, wept, and watered this land long before it was profitable. Old neighbors. A few vineyard workers who remembered my grandmother's voice better than any slogan. Even the mayor came in khakis and worn boots, carrying a dusty bottle of Syrah older than I was. I wore a simple navy dress. But what meant the most wasn't the outfit, it was the grapevine brooch pinned above my heart. Mateo had found it in the back of Carmen's desk drawer, wrapped in the same green handkerchief Grandpa had given me. Her initials were stitched faintly on the fabric. People smiled. They didn't ask about boardrooms or lawsuits or Jason. They asked about vines. About soil. About the name. Eleonora's table, I said, running my fingers along the new bottle label. She taught me that a table wasn't just where you ate. It's where you remembered. Where you passed things down. And they nodded. Because they understood. I was refilling someone's glass when I saw them, my mother, my father, and Jason, walking slowly down the path from the upper road. No longer bold. No longer center stage. Just present. Like the past hadn't completely let go of them yet. My mother's dress was beige, pressed to perfection. My father looked like he hadn't slept. Jason walked behind them, stiff and subdued, like someone who wasn't sure if he was welcome anywhere. Nice little gathering, my mother said coolly, barely glancing around. Don't get too used to it. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. They mingled briefly, circling, scanning the crowd for someone to impress. But no one turned. No one clapped their shoulders or leaned in to flatter them. They weren't the nucleus anymore. The sun dipped fully behind the hills. Then came the sound of gravel crunching. Grandpa had arrived. Mateo rushed to help, but Grandpa waved him off. His steps were slower now, more deliberate, but each one struck the ground like a signature. When he reached me, he took my arm. We walked to the small wooden riser beside the pergola, where Mateo adjusted the mic. Grandpa raised his glass. To the one, he said, voice steady, who remembered what family is supposed to mean. Silence fell. Even the trees seemed to hush. This vineyard doesn't belong to me anymore, he continued. And it hasn't for some time. It belongs to Kais. Not because of her blood. Not because of her name. But because she loved it when no one else did. Someone sniffled softly. Mateo, maybe. Or me. He turned to the crowd. By my hand. By Carmen's wish. And by the deeds she carried in silence, this land is hers. Jason stepped forward, as if jolted awake. You can't do that, he snapped. It's a family estate. Grandpa didn't flinch. Watch me. A man in a gray suit stepped out from the back, Mr. Landry, the estate lawyer. I can confirm, he said calmly, everything is already finalized. The land, the title, the operations. Irrevocable. My mother turned pale. You're tearing this family apart, she whispered, voice cracking. No, I said, quietly. You did that. I'm just rebuilding something honest. They left without another word. Afterward, I stayed late, folding chairs with Mateo beneath the paper lanterns. He handed me Carmen's blueprint again, the hand-drawn map of how she once dreamed the vineyard could grow. We sat together on her old garden bench. She wanted this to grow with you, he said. I looked out over the vines, then at the plans in my lap. I will, I whispered. Not from revenge. Not for legacy. But because I finally remembered who I was before they told me I wasn't enough. I stood and walked the rows alone, trailing my fingers across the vines. They didn't feel silent anymore. They felt alive. Waiting. As I passed the small plaque we'd installed near Carmen's favorite vine, I knelt and touched the soil. It read, "For Carmen. For those who bloom after being buried." I smiled. And for the first time in a long time, I was home. In the quiet aftermath of betrayal and silence, this story reminds us that truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of reaching the surface. Kais stood alone for most of her life, mislabeled as the disappointment, the outsider, the problem. But what she held all along was something her family had forgotten: loyalty that didn't falter, courage that didn't scream for attention, and a love rooted not in blood, but in memory and quiet care. Her grandfather's faith in her wasn't born out of rebellion, it was born from watching who showed up when no one else did. In a world that often rewards power, image, and control, Kais chose presence, truth, and integrity. She didn't fight to destroy the family that cast her out, she fought to preserve the one part of it that still had meaning. And in doing so, she reclaimed more than a vineyard. She reclaimed her worth, her voice, and her place in a story that had long tried to erase her. The vineyard thrived again, not because of its soil or profits, but because someone finally chose to tend it with honesty and heart. In every vine she touched, in every guest she welcomed, Kais proved that what endures is not legacy built on lies, but love planted in truth. The most powerful inheritance is not land or wealth, but the courage to protect what's sacred, even when no one else sees its value. And perhaps the greatest family we ever belong to is the one we choose to rebuild from the ruins of what we lost.